Good day. Welcome to a new feature in Harmony with Nature. This show, along with the next show, together form a part of a very interesting topic which is called Life Through Time. And I'm your host for today, Shalom Mandeville, and I'm very, very proud to present to you my guest today, Dr. Howie Donohoe. Dr. Donohoe is the Director of Education and Public Awareness with the Nova Scotia Department of Energy and Mines, and he possesses a doctorate in geology, and he also teaches, I think, for different courses in the field of geology at Dalhousie University. I first met Dr. Donohoe about 10 years ago, roughly, when he taught some extension courses in prospecting. And I had an impression that once I took the course, I probably will find my gold, which I have not yet. So I'm very proud to present to you Dr. Donohoe. And before we start going to the slides, now I see a whole bunch of rocks here, and even though I learned quite a bit of the course, you were saying that some of these rocks are 1 billion years old?
That's right. In the prospecting course that we were talking about, we just talked about the mineral resources and how to find them. And now we're looking at the fossil resources of geology, of the rocks here in Nova Scotia as well as around the world. So yes, all of these rocks in front of you are from a variety of different places in the Maritimes, and some from as far west as Ontario. I'm using various examples from around here, but the whole purpose is to give some idea of what life through time is. And that's really the topic, fossils and life through time.
So how old is time on Earth? Or how old is Earth?
It's quite old. The Earth goes back some 6 billion years. We've been measuring rocks that are about 5 billion years old, and we have fossils in rocks that are about 3.2 billion years old. I know that's a really hard thing to understand because time is, geological time is just so big, so broad. I thought what I'd try to do is give some idea of how geologists look at the Earth and look at the rocks, and then from there talk about geological time and see how the idea of fossils and geological time has evolved. So,
just before we go, do you still give that course on prospecting?
Yes, there will be several courses coming up in the spring of, in the fall of 1991 and again in the spring of 1992.
At Dalhousie University?
Well, it'll be in different locations in parts of Nova Scotia.
And these are like interest courses, right?
That's right.
As opposed to credit courses?
That's correct.
Well, I would very strongly recommend that people take those courses because you really appreciate the origin of Nova Scotia. So I guess we should turn to our slides, is it?
Yes, we'll have a look at a couple of slides just to get some idea of what some of these are. The first slide, and again, the topic that I want to talk about at first is really about how geologists look at time. So we have to look at the rocks. And this first slide is a demonstration of something very simple, a whole bunch of pancakes, and they're labeled on the bottom, A, B, C, and D on the top. And how can it be any simpler than that? Well, geologists look at something like that, and we see that A was there because B is laid on top of it, and C on top of that. This concept is known as relative time, and so those rocks that are above A are younger. And that's very important because everywhere we're trying to establish the sequence of ages. Now, I've changed the situation here a little bit, and now we see things that are tilted with something flat on top. A is in the lower right corner, and that's the oldest rock, and you notice that the layers are dipping towards you, and that means that the oldest is in the lower right, and they become younger towards the upper left. And on top, there's something else that is younger yet. Now this becomes important because if we find fossils in rock unit A in the lower right, those fossils are older than any other rock. And we establish that by the sequence of relative time. And now I'm going to introduce yet another complexity. Here we have the slide divided in half and layers across the top that are horizontal, and they're laid down on top of something that's underneath. And what's labeled B sort of looks like an inverted cone there. That represents a rock that was once molten, what we call igneous rocks. And these were pushed up into the earth, and they cooled slowly, and they crystallized into a solid. Well, this introduces us to another idea, which is that we can tell absolute time. You see, before with relative time, I could only tell you that layers C and D, the horizontal ones at the top of the slide, are only younger. I couldn't tell you how old they are. And if we have a rock that had some kind of radioactive mineral in it, it's like a little clock that ticks away. It's like my wristwatch right here. And I can see that it's a certain time now. And these radioactive minerals with radioactive elements in them will give us a ratio of end products to beginning products, uranium to lead, for instance. And this gives us an idea of how old it is. So now we can actually get at the exact age, the absolute age of rocks. So if we go back to have a look at that inverted cone, you can see that if I can tell you that that has a certain number of 452 million years old, plus or minus 2, then I've told you something about the age of the rock that's in green right around it, labeled A, which is the oldest, and the rocks above it, which must be younger than 352 million years. So we have, this is very important now, because now we can begin to talk about what geological time is. And now we get at the heart of your question, how old is the Earth? And what about all of these things that are displayed in front of us here? Well, these are all fossils. And these are important fossils. Some of them are...
I'd like to interrupt you there.
Sure.
What is a fossil?
Well, a fossil is anything that represents something on the Earth, any evidence of life. Usually it's hard parts, but I'm holding up something right now that actually isn't. This is actually worm tubes right here in my hand. And these worm tubes were the product of some living organism feeding along the bottom and producing upraised tubes, and this is what's left of it. So these are impressions, and these are fossils in a sense because they represent some degree of understanding ancient life.
How old that specimen be?
This comes from parts of the Triassic near North Mountain, actually near Scotts Bay. And so it's relatively young. But I wanted to bring that up because I have yet another fossil right here. This one is a sponge. I'll talk about it a little bit later. And the sponge shows the actual hard parts. It's like a honeycomb. And the animals, which were the sponges themselves, lived in each of those hard parts. So there's a whole host of different ways. Footprints are yet another means of looking at fossils. So we have impressions of where something moved, trackways, footprints, worm tubes. We actually have, as I said, sponges, or we have shells. I'm going to pick up a shell right here. And this is sort of like a present-day seashell. And this seashell represents the outside form of a shell, and the animal lived inside.
So approximately how old would that be?
This one is Devonian age, and it's approximately 400 to, well, let's go a little bit younger. It's about 370 million years, 380 million years old.
So you mean life was there on the planet at that time?
Life was well established.
I see.
Let's look at some of these geologists that went out looking for fossils and look at what they found for the earliest life forms. And this bunch of geologists are called paleontologists. These are the people that actually look at the rocks. I brought a couple of whimsical pictures to show. But I suppose first we have to deal with this whole issue of geologists and time. So I have to digress for a little bit here and talk about time. We've mentioned this, and the slide and the cartoon that I've shown there shows the major blocks of geologic time. 5 billion years of Earth history are tied up in the earliest form of geologic time. And that's the Precambrian era. And it was only the very end of the Precambrian that life began to flourish. Yet halfway through, we had some life forms, as I'll show you in a minute. And then the Paleozoic era in yellow there, where the big arrow is, that was a really substantial part of life on Earth, because here's where huge amounts of life welled up. We had a diversity of life that went from almost nothing at the end of the Precambrian to all sorts of things that we know today. And then
Can you put on some dates on them, please?
Sure. The end of the Precambrian time was 600 million years ago, and that was also the beginning of the Paleozoic time. At 250 million years ago, we changed from the Paleozoic, which was really the age of fish, the age of trees, the age of early amphibians, and all of the invertebrates, seashells and so on, to the age of dinosaurs, the age of reptiles. And that was the next period, called the Mesozoic, and that ran until approximately 65 million years ago, when, through some strange event, all of the dinosaurs were wiped out. And we'll talk about that in part 2 of the program. And then from 65 million years to the present is the Cenozoic era of time, and that's us. That's the age of mammals that changed into the forms that you and I are. And here, just ever so as an overview, in these 3 colors, the darkest green at the very bottom, there's almost nothing. All I want to get across in this is that at the very bottom of the slide, we have no caricatures representing life. And then coming upward from 600 million years to around 250 or thereabouts, we have all sorts of life forms, from the very simple to very complex. Fishes, reptiles, amphibians, everything. And then the brown color, the tan color in the middle, is the age of reptiles, the age of dinosaurs. That's the Mesozoic. And at the end of that, going into the light green at the top, that's when the dinosaurs died out. Reptiles are still around, but the dinosaurs are gone. And now it's mammals all the way to the top. So Earth history is full of changes over a long period of geologic time, and that's one of the most important things to really grasp in this. It's how we deal with time. You know, there's so much geologic time that everything can take place. Now let's look at these characters that went out looking for fossils. This looks like a bunch of bandits. They're actually graduate students at Princeton University. And it is whimsical, but I wanted to show you what some of the earlier parts of geology and paleontology were like. For the first 100 years of geology, from the 1800s until 1900s, there was a real search for fossils of all sorts. Now it comes down to very progressive work among a number of people, including local geologists in this picture of Robert Grantham, curator of geology at the Nova Scotia Museum on the left, and a local fossil and mineral collector, Eldon George, from Parsboro on the right. And they're looking at a skull of an early amphibian near Parsboro. So the fossils are all around. It just takes keen eyes and good looks. But let's see what these geologists found in the early days of life. I have a fossil here, Shlam, of some of the earliest large life forms that have ever been found. This is some blue-green algae called stromatolites. I'm holding it here. This is similar to what's found in St. John, New Brunswick. Now these are very primitive plants, and they were built up in mounds. We see them today. They exist in the Persian Gulf and other tropical oceans. And they're just...
Are you saying it's 1 billion years old?
This is about 1 billion years old, but they exist to the present. So this is something that has survived through all of geologic time, from about 1 billion years ago or more to the present.
That's fascinating.
And yet in Nova Scotia, we have sandstones like this. Sandstones laid down by rivers, perhaps, or in streams. and yet there's absolutely nothing in them. Sometimes it's due to the amount of heat and pressure. Sometimes it's just our inability to see what's there. But sometimes it's also in the rock, too. If the soft parts are broken down by bacteria or washed away, we'll never see them. If there are any hard parts, that's what we key on. But let's have a look at some of these very interesting early life forms. Here's an early life form from Halifax, Nova Scotia. I just wanted to show that we get all sorts of different ways of preserving fossils. Those are leaves in concrete, just 2 months old. How about a footprint? I mean, these are all the types of fossils that we look for. But here's one of the most interesting early finds in the 1930s. The tracks running across this long river valley. And there seems to be two sets. There seems to be a deep indentation track of what's obviously some kind of animal. And it looks like a footprint of maybe a man-like structure.
What's the location?
Texas. This was the first big controversy in paleontology. Man and beast were at the same time. We've shown now that actually this is a predator following a herd of other dinosaurs, and he was waiting for his chance to have a meal. But there's many ways that we preserve fossils. I was talking about worm trails. Here are some from rocks that are as old as 400 million years old, and we find them in much older rocks too. And I asked my 3-year-old, "What's that?" And he said, "A frog." And it's a type of identifiable fossil, but 65 million years old. So what I'd like to suggest is that many of the fossils that we see, including this insect that's in amber, which is a sap that oozes out of a tree, and the insect gets caught in there and preserved, what we see in the rocks we can identify as being part of our natural history and our life that we see today. But the way in which we actually begin to look at rocks is really quite interesting, because as we began to explore the rocks, some of the oldest on Earth, we came across some incredible finds. These are quite by chance, I have to emphasize. It's only by diligent work and thinking that there must be some form of life that we can see in very old rocks, we come across something. So what I'm showing on the screen now is a bacterium. It's a rod-shaped one. It's about 3.2 billion years old. It was extracted and has blown up quite a few times, several thousand magnifications, so that's not its actual size. But we have some early life forms. Most extraordinary was the find in Canada, in the Gunflint Chert in Ontario, of cell division. And this series of slides from left to right shows a plant cell, probably, that is changing from a cell that is whole to the next one that is dividing. You see it going further, and finally on the far right, there are two cells. That's exactly what we see on Earth now. Biology classes in junior high and high school talk about cell mitosis, and there is something that's about 2.2 billion years old. And finally, stromatolites. You saw that, and here's one in a slide. They grow in columns, these blue-green algae. And it's really interesting to come across these mounds in the old rocks of the Canadian Shield. But they represent life forms, and they're very significant because they're part of the group of rocks and animals and plants that began to add oxygen to the atmosphere. Because blue-green algae, like all plants, take in CO2 and produce oxygen as a waste. And with the advent of these plants, we began to have an oxygen atmosphere. And that means that finally, some 1.8 billion years later, something can crawl out on the land. So there's quite a history here in the rocks. And as we go to some of these very old rocks, we see the very simple forms. But now, as we go to the rocks at the beginning of the Paleozoic era, 600 million years ago, here everything changes. If you look at the bottom there, all of the forms on the left and right of a vertical column. And the vertical column represents time, and I'm going to be using this as sort of a coming back, a reference point all the way through part 1 and part 2 of the show. All of those forms are complex. They represent all sorts of different types of life forms. But some of them are really strange. Let's look at these. The ones on the bottom there are called trilobites, and they're relatives of insects. And they lived in the deep sea, and they're scavengers, swimmers. Some were very voracious and aggressive. Some of them had multiple eyes. Some of them buried themselves in the mud. But one of the most interesting things, I think, of anywhere has been the find of 570 million years ago or thereabouts in British Columbia of this animal. We don't even know what it is. There's nothing like it today. It's called Hallucigenia, and it's from the Burgess Shale, made famous by a number of explorations over the last 20 years. But what did it look like? Well, that's what it looked like. It was an animal that apparently walked on stilts. And yet that creature behind it that looks like it's really long, and how much is long, and what are the dimensions there? The white animals there on stilts are only about 4 or so centimeters long. The creature behind is perhaps 10 to 15 centimeters at the very most. And it is extraordinary in itself. It has one large claw that's going after that Hallucigenia on the left. And it had 2 sets of eyes that are sticking up and 4 other sets of eyes. So it could see everywhere. But it died out along with Hallucigenia. Those were dead ends and sort of the experimentation of nature. And when we look at the reconstruction of the ocean floor 570 million years ago in British Columbia and other locations around the world at that time, there are forms of life that we've never seen before and will never see again, because they're experiments. Very, very strange animals indeed. That floating creature that we're seeing now in the upper left is a jellyfish, and we know jellyfish. There's impressions of jellyfish in St. John City in New Brunswick. And yet that one has survived all of these millions of years through a freak of preservation. Very fine, silty mud covered all of these things. So what we have now in all of these different rock units of the early Paleozoic is shells like this. These are called brachiopods, Shalom. These are not relatives of clams, but they're a separate subdivision of the animal form. And of course they're like clams in that they sit on the bottom. This is the bottom right here. They sit right on top of that, and they have something that comes out and sort of feeds like this and pulls little one-celled animals and plants in, just like clams do. They're called filter feeders. And at the same time, here's a relative of the clam. Not really a clam in itself, but something very similar. I think some of the most interesting things that were in the ocean at that time were cephalopods. These things are relatives of squids and octopuses, and they exist today in the nautilus. Chambered nautilus is found in our oceans today. But these are shells that supported the soft parts. So we see the hard parts like this, and this curled one like that. So these are both similar animals, but different species and different shapes. But they were oriented with soft parts out here. And so they had tentacles out like this, and they just maneuvered themselves around something like octopuses and squids do, going after prey like that. Let's see some more animals. We're going into the middle part of the Paleozoic era. And in this map that I put up that shows all of the different colors of different rocks in Nova Scotia, we're looking at the orange rock, sort of orange-yellow color that's all across southern Nova Scotia. These rocks, part of the Maguma group, that had the gold in them, by the way, and we looked for in the prospecting course and so on. These are the rocks of early Paleozoic age. And do they have fossils? Well, let's see. Typical exposure down near Tangier. all ancient mud and sand. Not very much there, though. We looked and looked, and there's very few fossils in this group of rocks. But we find elsewhere a number of things, such as this very interesting shell. It's a relative of, well, it's not quite, I was going to say a relative of the clam, but it's similar to clams in that it feeds by filtering water through itself, and it's one of the oldest living fossils. We can find it in the Bay of Fundy. It's called Lingula, and yet this one is from the Ordovician period, which is the early Paleozoic, some 400 million years ago. So these shells are all around. One of the most fascinating group of animals are graptolites. These things were small. We're looking at something that was no more than about 20 centimeters in the width there on the screen. And these floated around the oceans of the world. And they look something like this. They were an organism that was communal, like corals, and each of those little things in a pocket was a separate animal. And they were filter feeders. They sort of floated around the oceans, stuck out their tentacles, and see what they could sweep out of the water. So we've covered quite a bit of ground here. We've gone up to, let's say, the Middle Paleozoic, and I have some examples just to show you what graptolites look like. You saw the slides. Here it is in the real thing. Here's a graptolite that is just barely a black smudge on here. And I can't even, I'm not even sure you can see it.
Yes,
but there it is.
Yeah, you can see it.
And this is what geologists look for. It's so very difficult sometimes to find things like this. But diligent work in looking for something like this really pays off. So these are from areas that are on the west coast of Newfoundland. I brought some brachiopod shells. Here's a whole colony of brachiopods. And again, here's the solitary brachiopod that I held up before in this hand. And here's what a whole host of these look like.
They're smaller there.
Yes, that's right. They ran in different sizes. Brachiopods at this time, Middle Paleozoic, 400 million years ago, did not get very large.
Oh.
What I can't show you, unfortunately, is the next geological era, that of the Devonian, when there was fish all over. Fish that were larger than the area right around us.
I guess we are running out of time for this part one.
Well, I think we should revisit some of this the next part.
That's right. You've just been watching part one of Life Through Nature, through the very enlightening presentation by Dr. Howie Donahoe. Thank you.